Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our first digital Working with Lots webinar. We're really happy to have everyone here and hope that everyone and their families are safe and staying healthy throughout these unprecedented times. So my name is Sarah Hayash. I'm the Director of Land Use and Sustainability at Detroit Future City. I say here, but this is my home office, so not really here. But we have a number of staff people that are also joining us and helping out with this this webinar. So Pierre Davis will be on in just a minute. She is our manager of the Working with Lots program. We also have Tamika Robinson and Susan Rusinowski from our team who are helping to manage the chat room. So if you have any questions, you can type those in throughout the presentation and we will get to those periodically. And then you will also be hearing from Kate Cherry, who is our development director, who's giving the bulk of the presentation on grant writing. And then we are also really excited to have Mandy and George, two past Working with Lots grantees, share their experiences. So I just wanted to make a quick note. Many of you probably already heard this information, but we have extended the deadline for the Working with Lots grant from April 13th to April 20th. And so the grant application has been open, at that time it will have been open for over 2 months, which is our longest open application period time in the 5 years of doing this. And so we hope that we're able to reach a lot of people, and we also hope that having this workshop and the 2 previous that we have had on community engagement and project planning and acquiring property have been helpful for everyone to start planning out their projects before the grant application deadline. So, and I think, I just also wanted to make the point that I think this current crisis has really highlighted the fact of how important it is to have public community green spaces in every neighborhood. So a place where people can go to relieve their stress and find some sanity and, maybe to get some physical activity and to, still be able to socialize with neighbors, even if it is at a safe distance. And so we are, we think that even in these challenging times, it's still really important to move forward with the Working with Lots program. So we really hope that you all consider putting in a grant application, and also just wanted to note that we will continue to monitor the situation and adjust the program accordingly. And then so the slide that's showing here, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the Working with Lots program or the field guide to Working with Lots, so you can visit it on our webpage. It's just dfc-lots.com, and you can see all of the 40+ lot designs that we have. But this was really this program, which was launched in 2015, was really intended to support grassroots efforts in transforming vacant land across Detroit neighborhoods. And so there are a number of design templates for folks to choose from, and we also have a workbook, which Pierre will get into a little bit, I think, that is intended to really help guide you through the process of planning out how to do your project and what lot design might be best. And our staff also is there to help you if you do become part of this program. So we provide a lot of technical assistance to support with that. And just wanted to note that in the past 4 years of doing this program, this is our 5th year now, but from the first 4 rounds, we awarded over $330,000 to community groups to implement these projects. So we've had 42 different grantee organizations who have installed 23 of the different lot designs that you find in the field guide. And a couple of years ago, we really took a focus on also supporting nonprofits and businesses and faith-based institutions in figuring out how to manage their drainage charge and installing green stormwater infrastructure. So we've done 7 of those projects so far, and all in all, we have transformed 8 acres of our vacant land across the city.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I was just going to go through some of the other workshops that we're offering this year. We put together this workshop program with the intent to help you and the greater Detroit community at large be successful in installing the projects that you are interested in installing. So now, of course, a handful of them might be subject to change just with the current pandemic. Obviously, this one was originally going to be at the Detroit Future City office. The next one is a garden maintenance workshop in May, and we might have to push that one back, but it certainly is an important one, and in fact, one that we require for all of our grantees. So just keep your eye on our social media or on the Eventbrite page if you're interested in attending that one. And then for today, just briefly going over the agenda, I'm going to hand it over to Kate Cherry in a minute to talk through the grant writing portion of this workshop, and then we're going to let George and Amanda share their knowledge with both, writing grants, receiving grants for land-based projects, and then other Detroit resources and opportunities that might be useful to all of you. Other sources of funding and ways to procure materials, with limited funds. And then I'm going to go through some of the questions on the Working with Lots grant application and call out particular, answers from past applications that were particularly strong, just to help you put together a great application. And then we'll have a Q&A towards the end. So there is a chat box where we would like any questions that you have throughout this webinar to enter them in the chat box. And then Susan and Tamika will be taking note of those questions and asking them towards the end. But I think just to keep this webinar more seamless and limit interruptions, we're going to ask the questions just be reserved to the last 25 minutes towards the end. But feel free to enter them into the chat box as they come to you, but we'll just get to them at the end. All right.
And then, Pierre, I just wanted to know that could there be a time during the Q&A period that we unmute the folks that are on the phone? Because they can't type in their questions.
Yeah, we can unmute towards the end, but we're gonna, hopefully everyone can stay muted for the first, during the presentation, just so that no one is interrupted, because I know we all have other things going on in the background. All right, Kate, please take it away.
Thank you, Pierre. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Pierre, what time do I have to on this one?
You have about 45 minutes.
Perfect. I actually did a quick run through of this the other night with the group. I think that's about what it took us. But there can be no delay because I had to go kind of quickly to get through that. So my name is Kate Cherry. I'm the development director at Detroit Future City. I've been involved in fundraising in the nonprofit community in Detroit for about 17 years or so, and have written many hundreds of successful grant proposals in that time. So this is something I like doing and spend a lot of time on. And the purpose of this presentation is to give you kind of a broad overview of the effective grant writing process, and to because we can't maybe get into everything that we would want to talk about in a semester of grant writing, we're going to focus on some of the common challenges that folks have and how to make sure that we're meeting some of the baseline requirements of effective grant writing, so that as you're putting in proposals for working with lots or other initiatives, you're at least putting yourself in a competitive situation where you can be sure that they'll take your proposal seriously and give it a good review on its merits, as opposed to getting hung up on some of the things that can derail us otherwise. So we're going to start with some level setting here. A lot of people think that a grant is just a donation like any other fundraising gift, but here's kind of my working definition of it. A grant is a contract by which one organization provides services to a third party on behalf of another organization. So the important phrases or words there, it's a contract, meaning you're telling somebody you're going to do something, you need to do it. You can't arbitrarily make decisions about how you're going to use those funds without consenting with the other party. You've made some agreement. Usually there's a little wiggle room there. A 10% variance on a line item is quite typical, and that will be in a grant agreement. There's usually a signed grant agreement. The other part that's really instrumental here in this definition is you're doing something for a third party on behalf of the funder, essentially. So that means you're looking for mutual aims, where your mission aligns with the funder, and you work together. The funder provides the funding, you provide the service or the product to a third party. So that means you have some obligation to deliver that to someone else. So you really have two stakeholders in this transaction: the party that you're delivering services and products to, and the party that funds it. So you've got a sort of three-way relationship in a grant, and it's your job as the grantee to make sure that you fulfill that. So we'll look at three different examples here. You really have three target audiences when you're looking for grants: businesses, foundations, and governments. Those are the big ones. Sometimes you'll find nonprofits that'll make grants, or quasi-independent organizations of all types, universities, things like that do make grants. But the big ones are businesses, foundations, and government. So an example of a business makes a grant to a nonprofit for some sort of beautification program so that it can improve the community for the people that work there, or it can improve the inputs that go into the business, right? So businesses think about grants typically in terms of the way they think about a lot of business, which is return on investment. They're making an investment into a community-based organization for a specific purpose to improve the quality of the community where they do business, or to achieve some aim that they have related to their business. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of banks fund financial literacy, things like that. A lot of newspapers like to fund literacy programs. There's a relationship there. So be thinking about why your audience is giving when you're approaching funders, and make sure that you're tailoring your particular interventions to the needs of those customers. So if I'm targeting a business and they're all about return on investment, I want to use a lot of numbers in that proposal. I want to make it clear to them that there's going to be a quantifiable impact. If you look at a foundation, it's a little different. Foundation is driven by its mission. So a foundation might make an investment in, say, a gardening program or a land use program because maybe they fund programs for kids and families, and you're going to do something that involves kids and families in your garden. So that's finding mutual alignment, finding some alignments, mutual aims there, and using that as an investment vehicle. So the foundation provides the funding, you provide the specific activities or strategies that are carried out to make an impact that serves both of your needs on a third party. Then the last example there is governments. So governments tend to be more rule driven, right? They emanate from legislation, from Congress and legislatures and councils. They've made a rule and they want to execute that on that rule. And so they're hiring people to help them do that. That's why they'll say things like, we want 12-point fonts and 1-inch margins, because they're very regulatory driven. They're just executing on some legislation that's been made. Local, state, federal, all very similar. It's just the scale, right? A local government's going to usually ask you for a bit less, and a federal government's going to ask you for a bit more in terms of detail and narrative and planning. But in contrast, right, so government is driven by this sort of rule-making ethos. Foundations are driven by their mission, that is the reason they're in business, and businesses are typically driven more by the return on investment and community inputs, things like that. Not always, there are exceptions to some of these, but good kind of rules of thumb to keep in mind as you think about those three audience bases that you have. So how do you get a grant? We could slice it 4,000 ways, but at the end of the day, I use a sort of 4-part system that I found pretty effective from my experience in the field. It's prospecting, it's identifying those funders, those businesses, governments, and foundations who have shared interests with you. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to sort of qualify prospects to make sure that they're right for what you're doing. It's moving on and cultivating relationships with those prospects. So you don't just move right into, hey, I heard you have a shared interest, can we have some funding? No, we want to build a relationship. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that effectively. Once we have that relationship, being clear in your ask of those folks, solicitation. So it's prospecting, cultivation, solicitation. That means asking them for funding in alignment with your conversations and the relationship you've built and the mutual aims and interests that you have. And then that last part is stewardship, making sure that if you do get funding, they are going to know that you're using their funds wisely and appropriately and in line with what you've told them that you'll do, right? And as much as you can kind of keep them in the loop on what you're doing and keep them involved and engaged, they become your best prospect, right? Your existing funder, retaining that funder becomes a key goal for you. And it's almost like if you can picture an upward spiraling parking ramp, that there is this virtuous cycle that emerges. When you have a prospect, you build a relationship with them, you effectively ask them for funding and use that funding as you said you would, and you keep them in the loop on it, they become your best prospect. And it allows you to build a better relationship and to seek out bigger funding opportunities with them and to use their funding in new and better ways with more trust, right? One of the rules of thumb we use in grant writing is people give to people they know and trust. And so that's what we're trying to do, is build relationships around common aims and common goals, and then use those relationships as the vehicles through which we activate funding. So in all my years reading proposals, and I read a lot of them and I write a lot of them, 4 big challenges that I see a lot of. And so that's what we're going to kind of structure the rest of the presentation around today. The first is that folks they often, especially novice or amateur grant seekers, will fail to qualify their prospects, meaning they identify someone they want to solicit and they don't do a thorough job of determining whether that is a priority prospect, right? There are 7 billion plus people on the earth, 8 billion, something like that. They're all prospects, right? Something like 8 in 10 people give to charity. So there's a lot of prospects out there. But your job is to find the highest priority ones so that you're using your resources most effectively and you can build your relationships most expeditiously, that sort of thing. The second one there is failing to build a relationship with your prospect. So we'll talk about that, but I mentioned this already. You don't build a lot of friends by meeting people on the street and asking them how much money is in their pocket, can they have it? You build good friendships, good relationships, and then people are happy to support you and be of assistance to you where they can and to pursue mutual aims with you, right? So building an effective relationship, we'll get into some of the way to do that. The third bullet there, a low quality proposal, we'll spend most of our time on that today because there are so many challenges for folks who don't, to be fair, most people don't spend all their days writing essays, and that's a lot of what grant writing can be, is writing essentially an essay. So we're going to talk about how to do that effectively and methodically, almost in a workbook-like fashion, so that you don't have to guess what needs to go in there. And if you're not an experienced or a veteran writer who does this all the time, we'll give you some tips on how to pull it together in a way that makes it clear and easily communicated. The last piece there, failure to document and share your results. This is about stewardship. I think I noticed the other day when I had this presentation up that that slide somehow got omitted. I think I didn't include it. So I'll just make a couple comments about that right here. And I've already made a few points about it, but we want our funders to have good, strong relationships with us and with our work, and to be personally invested in that work. And the more that we can make that happen, the better a future prospect that they become, and the more that they build trust and respect for our, trust in us and respect for our work. So this means things like taking pictures of your sites and making sure they include people and a narrative. So a picture of a field, may show where this project takes place, but a picture with the people standing there with the shovel digging into the field, and then a follow-up picture showing what they dug. Telling a story with photography can be a really great way to engage funders, as well as inviting them to the site, right? Getting them out, showing them what you're doing, and just making sure that they have opportunities for involvement and investment in it. So asking their opinion about things, letting people talk, even if you don't take their advice, reaching out to people and saying, I'm interested in what you think, and I'm going to use it to help shape the work that I'm doing. It's a great way to build these personal relationships that can evolve into long-term funding relationships. So starting in on qualifying your prospects, there's 3 words you want to keep in mind, and you can just kind of remember the acronym LIA. Linkages, interest, and ability. So if you think of prospects, if you think of relationships as sort of emanating out from the center of that target, that bullseye there, in concentric circles. At the center of that, we have the people closest to us, with whom we have the best existing relationships. So that's our board members, it's our staff, it's our volunteers, it's people we immediately do business with. Those are the people in the center. And the further out we go, are people more distant from us. So we want to start with the people who we already have some linkages with. That means the people as close to the center as we can get. People who have relationships with our board members, our staff, our volunteers, our partners. That's where we want to begin. Those are our highest quality prospects. In terms of interest, I see this a lot where folks will go to a website and they'll read about a funder, and they'll say, well, we kind of fit with that. I think we should go after them. Well, okay. Is that the best use of your resources? Maybe, maybe not. Take people at their word when they tell you what their priorities are. They're usually telling the truth about that. So there are a lot of prospects out there. Don't waste your time chasing and trying to fit a round peg in a square hole, that kind of thing. In terms of ability, foundations submit tax forms. So all those foundations that you're chasing, they've already told you what their ability is. It's at guidestar.org, which is a free website where you can see their tax forms. Not last year's, but usually within 2 or 3 years. So you can see how much they have in assets. You can see where they're spending their money, who they invested in, how much those gifts are, what size they are, right? So you know who your linkages are. You know who's in your network. Sit down, brainstorm, do that regularly. Be thinking about who you can build new relationships with all the time. Write down, talk to them, figure out what their interests are, and then look them up, find out what their abilities are. You can do this for individuals as well. You can do this for businesses as well. It's maybe a little harder than with, say, foundations or the government, where that information is public and transparent. With businesses, places like Crane's Detroit Business Newspaper will often put information about corporate philanthropy or corporation growth and size and things like that. They have a book of lists they put out every year, for example, that talks about the largest private corporations in the area, how big they are, that sort of thing. I'm answering a question that I see pop up. Linkages would be at the center, right? So the people closest to us are the people in the center, and the people furthest away from us that we have the fewest relationships with are on the edges. So a common novice prospecting mistake that people make is they'll send a team away to go identify prospects, and they'll do some research, and they'll come back and they'll say, well, this person's the richest person in the state. Or for 10 years or so, the two names that came up all the time were Eminem and Kid Rock. Everybody thought they were their prospects. And it's always like, well, technically, yeah, they're prospects, but do you have linkages to them? Do you know what their own interests are? What are they investing in philanthropically? And what is their ability? Sure, they're famous and on TV, but how much are they giving to charity? And where are their examples of it? So prospect qualification is about thinking those three things through, writing them down, and putting them in a place where all your team can have a discussion about how to prioritize. So once you've done that and you've got some priority prospects, this is when we begin cultivating those relationships, building those relationships. And I just want to include a couple of sort of rules of thumb or tips here to help that process along. So the first is personal contact is best. Any way you can do that is better than phone contact, is better than email contact, right? The more personal, the more in your face kind of discussion you can have with somebody, the more they're likely to remember you, right? It's just the same as with your friends and relatives. The more you see them, the more you think about them. So that means maybe going to conferences where those folks might be presenting, or doing a workshop, or listening in on a workshop, and trying to establish relationships that way. It means using third parties to introduce you, right? If maybe you know someone who got funding from a funder, maybe they can say to that funder, I've got somebody who I think you have a lot in common with. Would you like to sit down and chat with them? Right? Any way you can build a personal relationship. Ask for opportunities to discuss mutual aims. This gets to what I've covered a couple of times here, which is you don't start out by saying, can I have some money? Or I'd like to apply for a grant. That's not the way to build a healthy relationship. Instead, it's more along the lines of, my organization is working on X. Your organization seems to be working on Y. I think there's some mutual aims or some things we have in common. Would you like to sit down and talk about where there might be some synergies between us? Maybe we can achieve some goals that we have in common through our discussion, right? And so that becomes the agenda for your meeting when you get to have a meeting with one of these prospects that you've prioritized, right? It's just to kind of repeat that, to reiterate that, it's here's what I'm working on. Tell me what you're working on. Let's see if there's something that we might work on together, right? So when you do get that audience, this is a formal meeting, so you want to go prepared. You want to be dressed formally and professionally. Don't take it lightly. This is your audience with a funder. Bring materials. Bring things to leave behind. It might be a folder with your logo on it. Maybe it's a copy of your board roster or a description of your organization or your programs. Maybe it's some pictures or news clippings, right? You want to leave things behind, because even if they don't ever look at them, if they shuffle them around their office 5 times before they throw them out, that's 5 more engagements that you've had with them. It's subconscious, it's subtle, but it's the way that we start to become an identity for folks, right? They start to see us as, oh, this person's working in that space. Oh, they have those relationships. Oh, they're making a difference, right? That's what we're trying to do, is leave behind that image and that role for ourselves in people's minds. And then the last point really just kind of sums up the general approach, which is wherever possible, you want to show, don't tell. That means if you can get somebody to your office instead of going to theirs, that's the way to do it. If you can get them out to your project site, hey, more power to you. That's what you want to do. You want to leave an emotional tick. You want to leave a memory in people's minds so that they have a positive impression about the work you're doing. So we're going to jump now into this. The remainder of the presentation is really about writing a quality proposal. Some of the nuts and bolts of how do we put this stuff together. And I apologize if some of it seems a little 50,000 foot level or a little unrelated to writing, but there's a lot of sort of preparation and planning that can really help you with the writing. So I want to make sure we cover some of that folks are exposed to how to sort of methodically put a proposal together so that you're not just sitting there trying to make it up at the last minute, which is, I know from my own experience, it happens a lot. Someone says, oh, this proposal's due in 2 days. What do you got going on? And you sit down and you try to write it out. but there's a better way, I assure you. And so we're going to talk about, one, how you prepare so that when that happens, you're ready to go. Two, how you actually plan for the content of your narrative. Three, just some tips and tricks around writing to expedite that for you and ensure you don't get stuck. And then just some comments about revising and how important that is. So in terms of preparation, I often use this term channel preparation, which I picked up from some author some years ago who I unfortunately won't get credit for it because I can't recall their name. But it's this notion that anything you do towards a profession or an end is helping prepare you for that. So, you know, I am not a professional baker, but I made bread last week. So that's part of channel preparation. I have some exposure that helps position me if I decided tomorrow that I wanted to become a professional baker. And I think it's important to reflect on our own preparation for grant writing in a similar kind of way, that, you know, it's a trade like an electrician. There are people who've been doing it 20 and 30 years. They're going to have a lot of tools in their toolbox to help them be effective. But just because you don't think of yourself as a grant writer doesn't mean that you don't have some of those tools as well. So if you've ever done any writing, if you've ever done any project planning or project development, if you started your own nonprofit or are involved in the leadership or administration of a nonprofit, you're going to have some of these core tools just innately from those experiences. And so, you know, I say that to sort of discourage the feeling of overwhelm that a lot of people experience when they start grant writing, or when they are told, hey, I need you to write this grant proposal. People, I think, get overwhelmed by it. But you, too, have qualifications for it. They just maybe came in some ways that you weren't expressly thinking about grant writing. You know, in my experience, some of the most useful training for this work is just deliberate practice. And that means something very specifically, not just doing it, writing the proposal, but writing a proposal and working with your team to improve its quality and to revise it, and then to go back and fix it and do better and do better and do better. It's a very intentional process of making the quality better. And as you do that, you're going to start to see patterns and form habits that will serve you well. And then just there's a last comment there about subspecialties. So I think the more you get into this, the more you realize is a lot less about the writing than you would think. It's a lot about planning. It's a lot about understanding the terminology and just the sort of process that you have to go through. And then common pratfalls and common places where people start, because we don't all start in the same place. When I say to one of my colleagues, okay, what would you like to write this grant about? Some people will start in one place and some will start in another. And the grant writer's job is to navigate that and create a clear communication. So just a couple of comments, you know, here to give some examples of my own channel preparation. I was a writer as a kid. People always encouraged my writing, and I learned about the Cornell note-taking systems in middle school. If you've never come across that, I suggest you check it out. It's a system for taking notes on something that you're learning about, and for scaling from the sort of tactical to the, you know, from the granular to the 50,000 foot level. And I find that that is a very important skill in effective grant writing, is being able to navigate from tactical and granular information to high level. You need to move up and down that, because some people talk in one level and some talk in another. And the grant writer's job is to be able to understand the relationships between those things. And we'll get more into that, but Cornell note-taking is an important piece of channel preparation, I always think. You know, I did a lot of writing in school, and really probably the most valuable piece of my own experience was I worked with a veteran grant writer early in my career who had spent many, many decades doing this kind of stuff. And she was the first person who would ever read anything I wrote and bring a red pen to it and really go to town on it. And then sit and talk with me about every change that she would suggest and why a certain word was right and why it wasn't. If you can find someone to do that, of experienced writer, it can really, I think, improve your own writing habits. So this is sort of what I was alluding to when I said we're going to talk about some things that don't seem like grant writing, but I promise they are. You know, the first step in planning is understanding these relationships between the granular and the 50,000 foot level, if you will. And so this is sort of a paradigm I've sort of developed in my own head, but it comes from lots of sources just clumped together, where I think about the relationships in terms of change. So some people start out by trying to create broad community change. And that's about community behavior, typically. So we want people to behave differently. We want the community to have different qualities about it. So that's at a very high level, because you can't just snap your fingers and change the community. The community is driven by individuals and individual behavior. Okay, so what drives individual behavior? Well, it's the way we think about things, both slow and fast. This is the notion, there's a very popular book on this topic, that we have subconscious thinking and we have conscious thinking, right? So we have very slow conscious thinking, and we have intuitive, fast thinking that really grows out of our previous experiences and the things we've thought before, right? And the experiences we've had, they become our fast, intuitive thinking. Those in large part tend to be driven by our emotions, and our emotions tend to be driven by the environmental cues and sensations and the physiological inputs that our bodies pick up all day long. So, you know, the sort of crass example of this is if I'm in the woods and a bear runs up to me, I'm going to sense the bear. And my emotions are going to tell me, holy cow, there's a bear here. This is terrible. I'm either scared to death or I'm going to run away. And in that sense, my fast thinking is going to kick in. I'm probably going to run away. I didn't have to think about it. It's intuitive, right? Because I've known from past experience that when confronted with a major threat, I should act very quickly, right? And it's going to drive my individual behavior. But if I have a little time, if the bear is maybe 100 yards off, I'm going to think that one through. What should I do? Should I run? Should I stay? What should I do? It's going to cause my behavior. And over time, our behavior in aggregate becomes our habits and our character. And communally in aggregate, when lots of people do lots of things repeatedly and in the same way, we get community behavior. So I'm putting this all out there just to give you some thinking around change and change making, because every grant is on some level about change and change making. If we're writing a grant about blight removal, we're really saying we need to change environmental sensations and environmental conditions that affect how people behave and exist in the world. And other times we're doing things like saying our community is inequitable, our community has patterns that we don't like at a very high level. How can we change individual behavior so that we can alter those very high level community behaviors? So the way we're going to think through that is in grant writing language, right? It's a language all unto its own. These are common words that we hear every day, but they mean something very particular when we use them in grant writing. And so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what those are, in part because a grant writer is the one person who can speak that language in any organization. A lot of folks will use these terms in different ways and mean different things. And you need somebody who speaks the language well enough to be able to see what they mean when they say things the way they say them. So it can all be translated consistently. It's almost like your teammates all speak a different language and you're the person who knows all of them. So you have to bring it all together. So here's a sort of triangle, the pyramid of all these terms. And we start at the bottom with closest to us, the things we have, the inputs. This is the staff that we have, the volunteers we have, the people we work with, both as partners and also to change, the resources we have on hand, the cash we've raised, the time we're spending, right? That's our inputs. And we're going to use those inputs in action. So we're going to undertake very granular things, tactics, activities, right? I'm going to put those things to work. And the aggregate of those activities becomes our strategies. So these are the highest level, the way we talk about the things we're doing. So if your strategy is recruitment, maybe your tactics are to put up a website saying I'm looking to recruit people. and interviewing people I recruit, right? Those are sub-tactics of strategies. The way we count our strategies is through outputs. So if I'm recruiting, maybe my output is 10 people recruited. That's not my outcomes, which are higher on this pyramid. The outcomes are the changes we really want to make in the world. So in the example of recruitment there, recruiting 10 people is great, but it's not why any of us became nonprofit or charity-driven folks, right? Is to say we recruited 10 people. No, you want to make higher level change. And so there's 3 levels above that that are about outcomes. You have your objectives, which are specific what we want to do. And those sort of correlate in past tense. And I'll show you this a little different detail in a second. But if we make objectives in the past tense, we've essentially created our short-term outcomes. This is the things we've done at the end of our program or initiative. So if I set out on a 6-month program to create some sort of change, whatever change I've created at the end there, that's immediate, that I can measure 6 months on, that's my short-term outcomes. This is usually with people, things like changes in values or beliefs or skills, ideas, notion, knowledge, all that sort of stuff. Those two aren't really usually why we're doing our work. They're a little bit closer to it. Those are about individual changes. But above that is what we want to do on a more general level, which are our goals, or in, again, sort of past tense language, we'll call them our midterm outcomes. These tend to be about behavior change. So if I made changes in people in my short-term outcomes, those people are going to go away, and hopefully they behave differently in the future when I'm not affecting them, right? They're different now because of the changes we left in them. And so they'll behave differently. They'll do things differently in the world, right? So maybe if, let's say you ran a workforce program and you talk about changes in people, if they have new skills or knowledge, the behavior change becomes they actually go out and retain employment. They stay employed for a while, right? Or they put those skills to work on their own, right? That's behavior change. Getting up near the top there, we have our long-term outcomes, which really equates in the past tense to our mission and our purpose. It's all sort of on that same rung. And this is about what a lot of us are working for, which is the actual community change, right? Getting rid of differences and disparities and challenges and problems and things we see in our community that we want to be different, right? That's that highest level. So if I want to make that high level change, I'm changing how people interact in the world, and I'm doing that by changing how people think and feel and believe down below. And the way I'm doing that is through the strategies, those high-level activities that I'm undertaking, which can be broken down more granularly. And all of it is driven by the resources, the inputs that we have there at the bottom. The vision at the top is farthest away from us. So we started with the inputs at the bottom. That's where we are. Those are the things we have. And then we move to tactics, which are the things we can do, right? And if we keep moving up, we get further away from the things that we can do and we can control, and we get to the vision, which is out into the future. It's the new future that we want for the world. So there's 4 terms here that I want to be real clear on, because these are the big 4 in terms of grant writing. People use them interchangeably. They use them colloquially in ways that confuse them and make it hard for the grant writer to be able to do their job a lot of the time. So the grant writer has to have this understanding that these are 4 terms. They have a relationship, but they are different. And you've got to kind of translate what you're hearing from your teams and from your partners and the people you serve to write clearly in terms of your proposals. So you have goals and objectives. Those are what we're going to do. And then we have strategies and tactics. Those are how we're going to do it. The goals are general. The objectives are specific. The strategies are general, the tactics are specific. So the example that I've run through here is, if you say I want to travel to California, that's the goal that I'm trying to accomplish. My objective is to arrive in Los Angeles Tuesday at 4 p.m. It's essentially saying the same thing. It's what I want to do. I want to arrive in Los Angeles or travel to California. That's fairly synonymous, but it's at a more granular level. It's more specific, right? It gives me some details and exact locations, right? Same is true with strategies and tactics. If I say, well, I'm going to get to California by taking the train, I can break that down into the more granular, the more tactical. I'm going to buy a ticket, pack my bag, board the train, and go out to California. So people will often say, well, my objective is to travel to California. Or they'll say, my goal is to arrive in Los Angeles Tuesday at 4 p.m. And it's the grant writer's job to have their antenna go up when they hear those terms in conversation and when they see them in requests for proposals from funders, and to say, what are they really asking for here? Are they asking me generally what I want to do? Are they asking me specifically what I want to do or how I want to do it? And being able to move fluidly between these four terms is really going to help you to craft effective proposals, because what will happen a lot is someone will say, give me a brief statement about what you're going to do or what you're trying to do. And people will get very tactical and they'll go on, and someone will say, oh, this is not what I was asking for. It's way too granular, way too specific. And other times people will want the specifics, and you will give them something that's too general, and they'll say, well, you didn't really answer the question. And you'll say, well, I think I did. I said what I was going to do. And they'll say, no, I needed more, right? So there's no right level. This is sort of the art. We sometimes talk about the art and science of fundraising. This is the art piece of it, which is trying to use all of the context clues you can to figure out what's the right level, what's the right granularity, what's the right place that I want to have as a level of description and explanation. So we're going to move into logic models. This, I mentioned sort of this worksheet or workbook idea of how to write a grant. This is your tool. This is what's going to be collecting up the information we need to write an effective grant. You don't always have time to do these. You can't always get the buy-in and support of your teams, but the more you can do these, or at least think them through on your own, I think the more effective your proposal writing will be. So a logic model, which is sometimes called a theory of change, is just a graphic or a visual depiction that shows from the left to the right, the granular over to the 50,000 foot level. It starts with what we have and what we're going to put into a project or initiative. Talks about how we're going to use those things to make change. And there's a column there so we can kind of count what that change is going to look like. And then as we move to the right, we've got those three outcome boxes I talked about, where you have your sort of immediate outcomes, and then the future outcomes, and then the community change there, the long-term outcomes at the end there that you are really trying to make happen. What's beautiful about this tool is that you can start from the left, you can start from the right. So if you have an existing program and people say, well, I've already got these resources and I'm doing these things, sometimes they won't have good language or the ability to talk about the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. They'll just say very general statements about what they want to achieve, but mostly they'll say, well, I have to do these activities. I've been doing them before, right? So if that's the case, if you got that existing situation, you can start on the left filling this out and kind of testing how this works. If, on the other hand, you're creating something fresh or new, you can start on the right and you can say, well, what change are we trying to make? And in order to make that change, how do we need people to behave differently? And in order for them to do that, what will we need to give them, right? And you can do it from the right to the left. So it's a really great tool for testing, litmus testing, essentially, the quality of your proposal pitch by being able to move from left to right and right to left and asking yourself, does this make sense? We'll look at an example here in a second. But just a comment, another point I want to make about this. There's a name for moving from left to right, moving from right to left. So sometimes we'll talk about causation, which is setting a goal that you want to bring about. So when John Kennedy said, we should go to the moon, he didn't really know how we should go to the moon. He just said, we should go to the moon, let's figure it out, right? So that's causal goal setting, causation, trying to bring about a goal or an end. When you think about going the other way on the logic model, we sometimes call that effectuation, which is, I have resources, I have things I know how to do. What can I put them to use doing that's generally in line with my overall stated purpose in the world? Sometimes we'll think about like a chef. A cook is somebody who follows a recipe. So they start out by saying, I want to make a cake. And now I got to figure out how. Whereas a chef, who's different from a cook, a chef says, let me open the refrigerator and see what ingredients I have and what can I do with that, right? What can I make out of that? So just keep in mind these alternate ways that you can set and realize your goals. And one's not necessarily better than the other, but in certain circumstances, depending on what your position is, you might use one or the other more effectively. If I've got resources, an existing program, existing activities that I'm having a hard time shaping or changing, well, I might want to start with effectuation. I might want to say, how can I alter what I've got? As opposed to if I'm starting new and trying to make a big difference and thinking about how to do that, I might want to use the former there, causation. So here's an example of a logic model being put to use. So we'll start, I like to start on the right because I'm an idealist, I guess. We'll start on the right there. A long-term outcome, this is just an example that I threw together pretty quickly here. Let's say you're trying to make a greener world. That's your aim in this whole nonprofit ecosystem that exists, right? And so you've got two behaviors you'd like to change there in the midterm outcomes. You'd like to get a certain group of people to recycle more, and you'd like to get them also to use rain barrels more. Those are the two behaviors you'd like to see that contribute to that community purpose of a greener world that you're aiming for. Well, let's take that first one. So your midterm outcome, group A recycles more. Okay, what kind of program can I run to affect them in a way that they will recycle more? Well, I want to make sure that they know about recycling and how to do it. And so that's not a barrier for them, is that they're just not sure what to do. But I also feel like I need to change, provide some emotional kick for them, that they need to think this is important, right? Okay, so now I'm going to skip over to my activities. And I've got 3 activities there. I'm going to recruit some of those folks from those groups. I'm going to provide them some training, some knowledge, and I'm going to give them an experience. I'm going to take them to a landfill and show them how important it is. So in this way, my activities, which I can count in my outputs column, my activities, I can ask myself, are those enough? Will those things added up create those short-term outcomes? And will those short-term outcomes, when realized, lead to the behaviors that I'm trying to change? And will the aggregate of those behavior changes lead to the long-term community change that I'm trying to realize? This is why it's sometimes called the theory of change, because we're moving from one side to the other and asking, is this reasonable? Is this hypothesis likely to work, right? So in some way, every time you write a grant, you're making a bet, right? You're doing a science experiment to see will A lead to B, right? On a very simple level, or in this case, we're talking about very complicated and complex challenges. So it's not always clear that A will lead to B, but maybe A, B, C, and D will all lead to B, that kind of thing. And if you get really good at this, or if you're very scientific about it, you can look at the literature, right? There's research that tells you whether A will lead to B in a lot of these cases. And so if you want a grant, say, from the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health or someone like that, you need to be able to speak fluidly about that literature and not just suggest that A will lead to B, but to have lots of evidence that there's good reason to believe A will lead to B. I see a question here about outcomes versus outputs, which is a common challenge we get into understanding those terms. So outputs are the quantifiable aspects of our activities, which in a logic model we're talking about our strategies, because we could get granular in there, but we're really just trying to highlight our strategies there. We don't want this to be super long. So for example, recruitment is not the change I'm trying to make in the world. Training is not the change I'm trying to make in the world. These are strategies. These are things we're doing. They're a means to an end, right? What we really want is people to know about recycling, people to feel recycling is worthwhile, people to actually recycle, the world to be greener. Those are outcomes. Those are things we want at the end of the day, whereas our outputs are just the way that we're counting the process that we're using. So it's the difference between process, sometimes it's called process objectives versus outcome objectives. I think I've answered that for Tori. Okay, we're gonna move on. So here's where the magic kicks in. So we just created that logic model, and now we have a lot of what we need to write a grant, because we're going to change the tense here, right? So I'm going to go back. So my outcome, my long-term outcome, it says I want a greener world. Well, remember that triangle? We said that a purpose or a mission was about the same as a long-term outcome. So I'm just going to invert the language. I'm going to say, well, my purpose then is to bring about a greener world. The outcome is we have a greener world, but the purpose is I'm going to bring about a greener world, right? So it's going from sort of a verbiage in purpose to an existing state with the outcome. Same with goals. So our midterm outcomes were, let's see, I forget already, one slide away. Recycle more, collect more rainwater, okay? So those become our goals. To encourage recycling. We added a verb essentially, but trying to represent what's in there, right? To get people to behave differently, to recycle more, our goal is to encourage recycling. We do it very plainly. To expand rain barrel usage is the equivalent of that people use rain barrels more, right? Same trick works for the objectives. They come from our short-term outcomes. And then our strategies really just migrate right over. These are the questions that every grant maker is asking you. Tell us what your purpose is. Why are you doing this? What are your goals going to be with this grant? What are your specific objectives? Tell us about your strategies. I can't do it right now. This is just a little bit more if you're hungry and thinking about this. Evaluation is such an important part of sort of the scientific experience of grant writing. If you go this one step further, I think you'll be even better positioned in terms of program planning and design. So a lot of funders ask you, how are you going to evaluate your success? And you can say, the stock answer is we're going to hire a third-party evaluator. That's what everybody wants to hear. But that's expensive and timely, and a lot of us, can't do it or won't do it, or we can't do it for everything, that kind of thing. The more you can do it, the better, because you'll gain a lot of insight about program planning and design that way. But here's a quick and easy way to show that you're thinking about the quality of your work and the integrity of your work and measuring whether it's actually done what you set out to do. So you start over there on the left-hand column with your goals, your objectives, your strategies. And you think about what is an indicator, what's a measure I could use to articulate that thing had happened. And let's set a target. We're not always going to meet our targets, but the goal is to meet 80% of our targets. So what's a realistic target for that indicator that would tell us we had achieved our goal, our objective, our strategy? Be specific. What is my data collection method? How will I collect that information that I set out to achieve? And when will I do it? How often will I do it? How often am I going to write that stuff down? If you're doing this kind of stuff, you've put together the basics of an evaluation plan. You're thinking about where the data is coming from, how you're going to get it, how often you're going to get it, what you're trying to achieve very specifically. You sometimes hear about smart goals or smart objectives. This is the smart part behind it. This is tell me what you're going to do very specifically. And we can do that for each part of the data that's in our logic model. But it becomes harder as we get sort of more towards the 50,000 foot and further away from the granular. And it becomes of maybe sometimes less utility as we get too granular. So if you look at that first example there, to bring about a greener world. Well, maybe we don't set an indicator for that. You could set some indicator or indicators and say, we're going to know we realize that tomorrow when we meet certain community standards. But realistically, community change takes a long time, and a lot of grants are for 1 to 3 years. So if it's going to take us 10 to 15 years to make a much greener city, then there's probably not too much utility in trying to think about indicators and targets for that, because there's a mismatch between the funding source and the long-term reality there. Now you can, like I said, in fact, some of the most effective organizations do that. Folks who work on collective impact, folks like the Harlem Children's Zone, which became quite well known for some time, they set 10-year visions. They set 10-year futures, right? And they track and manage data for all that time. And they try to get their funders to come on board for all that time and make long-term investments. So that is a very specific sort of organizational strategy that you could pursue. But realistically, if you're just trying to get a grant, you might say, well, we're not specifically trying to track our purpose in terms of an indicator, but our goals we can track those. Sometimes you can't really track your goals. Your goals will be even a little too tricky to track, or that's not where your focus is. So sometimes you won't track them, but ideally you want to have some indication that your goal was achieved. But certainly for your objective as you go down there. So what we've got here is essentially our purpose at the top, our goal around recycling. And we said we're going to see how many people are still recycling 1 year after they leave our program. And our goal is that at least 60% of them will. And we'll follow up with them in a survey by phone 12 months after the program, right? That's the way we're going to do it. Now that's going to give us essentially an outcome measure. It's going to give us an outcome piece of data that tells us, did we realize the future we were trying to bring about? As we go down further in the chart here, and we get more to like our objectives and our strategies, specifically when we get to our strategies, we're going to have essentially a process measure. I mentioned this recruiting members of Group A, the number recruited 10. And so the way an evaluator is going to look at this stuff is they're going to say, well, was the outcome realized? Yes or no? If it was realized, great. What went well, what didn't go well, but they still got there. If it wasn't realized, let's look at the process. Was the process executed as planned? So they're going to ask, okay, well, did you do the things in terms of recruitment you said you were going to do? Maybe I only got 6 recruitees instead of 10. Well, why? What happened? What didn't work? That's learning, right? That's process learning. Whereas up higher in this chart, in terms of what's essentially our purpose or goals or objectives, the learning we have about those things are going to tell us about our outcomes and how we can maybe be more effective in the future, or what was wrong with our theory of change, essentially. But as we move to those sort of tactical things, our activities, our strategies, that's going to just give us information around process that we can use to improve our future proposals. So we'll do, let's see, Pierre, how much time do I have left?
It's about 7 o'clock, so we have some flexible time, but.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up.
Take what you need, sure.
Okay, so tips and tricks around writing a quality proposal here. We'll run through a few. Some of this is, just common, I hate the phrase common sense. I know a lot of people love it, but some of it seems like common sense to me. Be concise but thorough. So don't give me one sentence answers. No one was looking for that. But also don't just wax poetic as your answer because you think it should be longer. Read the question that a grant writer or that a grant maker gives you and answer that question with some supporting detail. That's the goal every time. Where you can, aim to establish your capacity and your credibility. Mention your strengths, mention the resources you have available, mention how you've been recognized, how you've been successful. You wouldn't bank with a fly-by-night operation and nobody wants to send you a check for a project just the same, right? You want to establish that you've got some capacity. Even if you're a new or a startup organization or you have limited resources, just highlight what your strengths are and make sure that comes through. Not everyone's a great writer, but try to be consistent in your grammar, your punctuation, the words you use. There's all sorts of, we could run probably a 4-year program on good writing. We're not going to do that, but just try to be consistent because that's one thing that catches people's attention is when you're inconsistent in your usage of certain punctuation and grammar. There are things that I think are the best way to do it, and there are things someone else might think. And I don't usually knock somebody down as long as they're consistent in it. But once they start going all over the place, that suggests to me that maybe they've not thought these matters through entirely. I said this before about cultivation, but this is business writing. It should be formal. It should not be vernacular. It should be third person. It should not be first person. Part of that is that helps you to build your capacity and credibility by talking about your organization as an institution. It sets it on a higher bar and a higher level than by speaking very colloquially, very commonly. You don't want to be perceived as common. You want to be, perceived as exceptional here. So use formal language. And the biggest point on this whole page is answer the questions. Follow the guidelines. Use the guidelines they give you as what you should respond to. So here's how you do it. If you haven't, if you have, writer's block or you have trouble writing, start with the outline that's in the request for proposals. Start with a common outline, and I'll talk about one in a second. Bullet it out, make an outline. Add in the bullets of the things you want answered, the things you want to put in there, right? Don't worry about fancy writing. Don't worry about sentence structure. Just bullet it all out. So if they're asking you what the problem is you're trying to solve, put in some bullets. If they're asking you about what your specific solution is, how you'll do whatever you're going to do, bullet out. And then if you do get stuck, I find it's always helpful to just imagine you're telling somebody else, because when we're trying to write, there's all sorts of machinations in our head that get us caught up. But I've never met somebody mid-sentence who just stopped and said, God, I can't think of anything else to say. So sometimes people fall quiet, but I don't think it's just because they've just run out of words. So try to imagine you're having a conversation. That will usually at least give you a start on what you're trying to put down on paper. And write that down. Write down whatever you would say. And then you can fancy it up later. So once you've got all those bullets, and you've got that outline, you've got the general nexus of a proposal. So try to link it together. Try to use some transition words. Try to make it all flow as best you can. But just make sure that you've got the content in there that you really want to have. And then do the best job you can with writing. The last point here, be the frog DNA they talk about in Jurassic Park. This is just my own personal spin on this, which is, when you ask your colleagues what you should put in a proposal, they often don't have all the details. They often haven't thought it all through. That's not a knock on them. It's just the way we operate as humans. And so the grant writer, part of their job is to fill in some of the missing pieces, to be the frog DNA, if you will, that they use to complete the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. You have a little license. If pieces are missing from your proposal, propose them. That's why it's called proposal writing. Pitch them, put them in there. And when you circulate it for review with your colleagues and your volunteers and whoever else you're using to look at your proposals before they go in, those people will react to it and they'll say, this sounds right, this makes sense, or where'd you get this crazy idea? Don't take it personally. Your job is to create a cohesive whole. And so fill in some of those gaps where they exist. I mentioned just a sort of common outline. There's 3 questions that are used to write every request for proposal. And sometimes they're broken down very specifically and will result in 4,000 questions that you have to answer, and you hate those people. And other times, they're very high level and there's not much guidance as to what you want to write. But at the end of the day, most funders want to know, what's the problem or challenge you're trying to solve? What's your specific way that you're going to solve it? And, why are you the ones to solve it, right? Why are you the ones to create change in some way that the funder cares about? So if there are no instructions given, every time I'm going to write a proposal that looks like this. It's going to say a brief summary of what it is that I'm going to write about. And then it's going to hop into, here's what we're trying to change in the world. Here's how we're going to change it. Here's our methods, here's our approach, here's our strategies, here's our timeline, here's who we're going to work with, and here's our capacity. Here's who we are, here's our history, here's the work we've done that's built up to this point, here's the resources we already have on hand to make this happen. So, general commentary on writing a paragraph here. I think this is something we all need to be reminded of. A lot of us probably got something like this in school, but my suggestion is always to think of a paragraph like a table, that the tabletop there is your thesis. It's the main point. So start with your main point. What are you trying to communicate? Provide the table legs, provide some supporting evidence that makes that point for you. And then end with some either summary of what you've just said and or a transitional thought that helps lead to what you're going to talk about next. So let's look at this in practice. Here's an example of writing a problem statement. So the organization in question is called the Riverside Neighborhood organization or something like that I've just invented. And let's say I need to write a problem statement for them, a statement of what thing they're trying to resolve, what change they need to bring about. Well, here's 4 bullets that I could sort of make up about them. And it follows that pattern. So the Riverside neighborhood has an emerging rodent problem. Boom. If I say nothing else, I've made an assertion of what the problem is, which is a direct answer to what the question is, right? The question is going to be like, tell us what your problem or challenge is. And the very first sentence tells you the answer to that question. No one has to guess what you're trying to solve for, right? Okay, well, the next two bullets there are my supporting evidence. Local residents, anecdotally, we know, keep encountering mice and rats. And here's a little data fact that I've thrown in. A local nonprofit reports that they've been catching a lot of these rats in their rat traps, right? Very specific. Remember what I said at the beginning about audiences. If you're writing to a business, they're going to maybe want to see a little bit more in terms of data. And if you're writing to a foundation, they might be looking maybe more of the anecdotes and more of the human side of things, right? So just sort of keep that in mind. Know your audience. That last sentence is both sort of a third supporting evidence and a transitional statement. So, moreover, the community has surging numbers of squirrels, skunks, and wombats. Well, that could lead to a whole nother paragraph just about that particular issue, or it could set me up to start talking about the solution. So in that way, it just becomes a supporting evidence, right? You can expand this. You can have 3, 4, 5, supporting evidence statements in there, whatever. But you want to generally keep your paragraphs fairly short because white paper goes a long way in making things readable, right? White space in your paper. So if you're writing to the National Science Foundation, sure, you can have your 10-sentence paragraph. But for everyday use, you usually want to have between 4 and 6 sentences. So this sort of format tends to work fairly well. A final comment here just on revision and its role in grants. No matter how well you think you've done on proposal writing for the day, if you come back tomorrow after a good night's sleep, you will find mistakes. I still, after almost 20 years, will come back the next day and find mistakes, find ways to improve what I've written, right? So, take a nap after you've done some writing before you start to revise it. Share it with other people. Other people are going to give you different perspectives on what's important and what reads well and what doesn't. And like I said earlier, just sort of deliberately sourcing external input is going to improve your own grant writing skills. So you start to pick up those patterns and habits. And in the future, you're going to just going to do a better job, period. That's the duration of our presentation tonight. So here, I think we probably have questions and answers, but thanks everybody for your time. I hope that this was at least somewhat useful for you in your proposal seeking, and good luck.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to George Adams first from 360 Detroit, and then Amanda Moran, and we'll do questions at the end. George was working with Lots Grantee in 2016, and since then he has scaled up and done received more grants and has been doing larger projects and in more parks. And so I just wanted to have give him the opportunity to speak about his experience and with grant writing and in the projects that he's done and what his organization does.
Thanks, Pierre. Hello, everyone. My name is George Adams, founder, president of 360 Detroit, Inc. And I'm excited to be here tonight. So I just want to share with you, 2016, as Pierre said, we received a Working with Lot grant, and we did a side lot, and we converted that lot from just grassy to, we added some trees and some roses there. It's the one on the right, upper right corner. And we did the rear parking partner. We changed it a little bit, but it was really exciting working with Detroit Future City on this project. To the left, we started off with that lot. I think maybe 2 years or a year after that, we petitioned Wayne Metro to do something similar to the Detroit Future City lot. And you can see that to the lower right after it's completed. We had a fun day there for the children. And then the third picture, 1, 2, 3, third picture is what we're working on right now. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We're working on developing 20,000 square feet vacant land, converting it into a park. So when we did the DFC lot program. That was our first major grant that we received. And then from there, we went into, our next one was Wayne Metro, which we were able to capitalize on there. So we started off with doing beautification projects. We got about 40 acres of vacant land in our footprint. And so converting and reusing the land was very important to the residents in the community. And so we engaged the community with several different events, trying to get their input on what they wanted to see. And biggest thing that they wanted to see, the most major thing they wanted to see, was a park in the community. So we began to seek out funding for the park, began to build relationships, and we found out about KIP D. We found out about KIP D, and we waited like a year and a half, maybe 2 years before we applied, because I don't think we were ready the first time around. And so that was the most extensive grant proposal that we put together as a team, was the KIP D Kresge. And so we applied for that grant for planning and implementation of the park specifically. And so we were excited to get that. One of the things that they require is letters of support. It's from the community and people that you're going to work with and people that you're serving. And so we were able to create, we were able to have already on hand data that we had been collecting over the years. So we just presented it to Kresge with our proposal. After we got Kresge, we went after some funding for the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, Ralph C. Wilson Legacy Funds. Now our goal was to be completed with the park a little bit sooner than we are, but things came up with construction and time for frames and things, so we were delayed a little bit. But our funding with Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan was for continued community engagement, and it was supposed to be for programming. But like Kate had talked about, there's some flexibility in there. So we were not done, so we were not able to do programming. So they allowed us to do some of our funds into construction. And so we have those funds available for construction now. But that was we initially had to build the relationship. So we initially talked to them. The funders wanted to talk to you, see what you want to do before you submit a proposal. So that was maybe 1 or 2 conversations that we had with the program officer regarding our project to see if it was feasible for us to even apply for it. After we did that, we were funded that. After that, we moved over into the LISC. We found out about LISC. Now, the relationship with LISC is probably the longest relationship we've had, which is probably about 4 or 5 years. And we found out about LISC replay 2 years prior to us applying, but we had a relationship with LISC for about 4 or 5 years. And so we decided to apply. What put us in the position to apply for LISC is because we had received the Kresge funding. That put us in the best position because they wanted a dollar for dollar match for the LISC replay. Again, we had letters of support. We also was able to get letters of support from other funders to support us with those proposals. So that was exciting that we were able to get those funds, and those were specifically for the construction and implementation of the park. So for me, I went to Wayne County Community College for their grant writing workshop, which was a 12-week course, and I received the grant writing certificate. We had an awesome instructor. Her name was Shelly Norman Heel. She's been active in the nonprofit community probably over 30 years, give or take. So it was great to be under her tutelage, and periodically I still meet with her from time to time to give her updates and just to get her input. So I think that having a grant writing mentor is great. Having someone that you can bounce ideas off of and to give you some feedback is excellent. That's pretty much what I have. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time, Pierre. If you want me to add something, I can, but that's pretty much.
Well, I just added the extra slide that you sent. If you want.
Okay, so this This is how the land looked a few years ago before we cleaned it up, where we're going to have the park. And then this is the updated rendering of the park site plan. And we're hoping to begin construction this year. That's our goal.
Great, thanks, George.
Thanks, Pierre.
And then Amanda was going to share some of her experiences getting other items and, you know, discounted items or items for free, and, you know, being able to put like put things into her site without additional grant funding.
Did I answer that last part?
Oh, I was just saying, well, you know, what you've done for your site without like additional funding.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I did the Paisley Patch project, and that involved like a certain kinds of specific plants. And I found a lot of those at Block's greenhouse. It's in Romulus. It's right near the airport. It's kind of south of the airport. And then there were a few that were more challenging to find. And I found them at Rulig's in Brownston Township, which is a bit of a drive, but I found definitely worth going there. They have an amazing selection of plants. And a lot of the materials I got on Craigslist. It's always been like my favorite website. I love that Craigslist has never really changed. It's the same layout and everything. But the free section I used for a lot of my materials, partly because I wanted to recycle as much stuff as possible. And then also, you know, the free section is free, and you're doing somebody a service in terms of taking something off their hands. So I liked all those things. You definitely have to be like kind of obsessed with Craigslist. Like I feel like I'd wake up, check it in the morning, and like, luckily I feel like most people are, you know, we're all kind of obsessed with our phones. So it's just like another thing to check on your phone. But it does take a lot of dedication. So it's not necessarily for everyone. In terms of the stuff on there, if you start looking at it regularly, you'll start seeing like a pattern of certain things that are a lot easier to find than others. And I feel like I've probably made hundreds of emails on Craigslist. So I feel like when you do see something you want, you need to email them as soon as possible. And I found like I had a better ratio of getting things if you don't ask any questions, because people, you know, they don't want to be, they're getting probably like tens of, you know, depending on the desire of the thing they're giving away, they might be getting up to like, you know, 50 emails. So you want to, you know, not bother them with a bunch of questions. Just say, I want it, I love it, when can I pick it up? And yeah, I'm trying to think, is there anything else specific that you want me to talk about, Pierre?
Well, how did you like the Arbor Day Foundation and the trees and maybe some of the things that you got from Keep Growing Detroit?
Oh, right. So I think, yeah, I feel like I found about this on Facebook, but it seems like every Arbor Day, which is in spring, I think it's different in every state. I don't remember the exact date. I think it's like the end of April. But I feel like a lot of nonprofits have a tree giveaway. So I would just kind of keep that holiday on my radar. And I've gotten multiple trees from various foundations that are giving away trees. Like I went to one in Dearborn, and then there was one right in my neighborhood, right in Corktown. There was one year on Belle Isle. So yeah, I guess I've been to 3 different free tree giveaways over the years because of the Arbor Day holiday. And the foundation also, I just did this year. I'm not super familiar with the actual technical Arbor Day Foundation, but I know for a $10 membership, they will send you 10 free trees. So that's pretty cool. I'm waiting to get those this month. But yeah.
Oh, thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, no problem.
So I wanted to just touch on a couple additional resources in Detroit if you're looking for both volunteers or donated flowers or free trees. The city of Detroit, through different programs, provides all of those to Detroit residents. And then next door is another platform that is a great resource for neighbors that might be trying to give something away, or neighbors trying to find something. And you just can post that on the app or the website, and people in your neighborhood are able to respond. And it's a great way to just connect with the neighbors and also find and share resources. So I just wanted to highlight those as well. But to transition to the 2020 Working with Lots grant, our request for proposals, there's a number of different sections. If you're familiar, if you're going to apply this year, you're probably familiar with the application at this point. Most of the long form questions are in section 4, so I just wanted to pull out a handful of these and give some examples of great responses that we've got in the past, give you a sense of, what we're looking for. So for question 4.1, what is your motivation to transform your lot using the field guide? Of course, that question, the answer is going to be different for everybody, and we don't want you to just, copy this answer, but this is just an example of this, a straightforward and to the point. They didn't need to use the up to the word limit or write, 2 paragraphs. As Kate mentioned before, like they stated the problem right away. There's very few parks and community spaces in their neighborhood. It tells you what's happening, tells you why they want to do it. Seeing landscape, change the landscape with flowers as a way to, easily change a blighted lot into something beautiful. They wanted to provide a safe space that neighbors can be proud of. And then again, rather than restating something that they've answered in a previous question, they mentioned that this project is aligned with their organization, which they already spoke about in the previous question when we asked, tell us about your organization. So again, just a straightforward, to the point. 4.2, how will the space be used after implementation, and what is your long-term commitment to this project? So the second part of that question, Detroit Future City wants to make good investments with this grant rather than give the grant to a project that may only last 1 year or 2 years. I think that's one of the main reasons, or one of the important reasons, why we require grantees to own their property, so that you have control over what happens to it long term, rather than the city or land bank or some other owner deciding to change it, a year after you spend thousands of dollars transforming it into, the park that you're envisioning. And then how will the space be used after implementation? We really are looking to fund projects that become community spaces and open to the public, rather than private, private property. Of course, it remains private property technically and legally, but it's really for the community. So this was a great response. Speaking of like organic and sort of natural use, but also structured activity as well. So it's, it's for leisure play for kids, but also, there's going to be curriculum related to the rain garden. And also mentioning that they have a long-term commitment to this project, and what that commitment is. 4.5, describe your project implementation plan. So we liked this response because they broke it out into phases, and also are familiar with Miss Dig, which is a free service that will come out to your site and tell you, and make sure that there's no underground utility lines that you might be hitting when you start digging. So that should be the first step of any land-based project. But then the other 5 phases, knowing that there's going to be site cleanup where they're going to have to remove a lot of trash or weeds, other debris. Phase 2, any like weedy trees that have been growing, for a number of years, tree trimmers will have to come out to remove that. And then once, the site is how you want it, any site prep that might be necessary, removing sod, amending the soil, dependent on, what your soil test results say. And then phase 4, planting. And also recognizing that, once the plants are in the ground and they're mulched and watered, the job really is not over. There's a lot of maintenance, and then an education component is also part of the grant. So just them, breaking this out into 5 phases was really helpful and clear. 4.6, how will you engage your community in the planning and implementation of the lot design? So again, this gets back to the public, this being like for the public and engaging the community around this project, making sure that this is something that they want and it's not just something that you alone want. So this is a good response, engaging the community through flyering, social media, notifying residents, meetings, events, volunteer opportunities, inviting participation, asking them for ideas, seeing what they want that site to be used for. And then, afterwards, using participants and sharing like new skills, and all working together. So that was a great response. 4.7, describe your education and programming plan. This is similar, but more, rather than just like how is the community going to use the space, this wants you to get more into the like specifics of what your plan is for that to happen. So with this answer, they said there were 4 different types of engagement that they were planning: volunteer days, educational days, planting days, fun like leisure, summer movie, planting parties. So there's so many different options for how to activate your site, program your site, and so this was just one of the responses that we really liked. Them coming up with creative ways to engage the community after the lot design is installed. And maintenance is a really important one, and something that a number of grantees have struggled with in the past. One thing to really consider is if you're relying on youth groups like Sunday schools or after school programs, how long do you have those students for? What part of the year? Do you only have them for the summer? Do you only have them for the school year? Both of those would provide maintenance challenges, because gardens and parks really need to be maintained, March or April through October, which cuts both into the school year and the summer. So downtown boxing gym runs programming all year long, so that was great. They wouldn't have faced the challenge of only having kids for half the year. And they highlighted that they have a water source, next to their on their part of their building, which is next to their lot, and hoses and watering cans. So again, this maintenance plan answer can be a lot longer. It depends on what your water source is and how many volunteers you have available to you. But luckily for them, they had water available nearby. And also they recognized that they needed to set up schedules to make sure that the water is needed, or the lot is watered when needed. Also wanted to briefly go over how to submit a great budget, because submitting a budget is one of the questions for this grant program. So these are just a few things to include when pricing out your design. Finding suppliers. Kate, I see you're controlling my screen. Finding suppliers for mulch, compost, soil, any garden tools that you might need, plants, contacting local nurseries and getting pricing lists for the plants, the perennials, the trees, the shrubs, that you might need. Watering plan, if you need to build an irrigation station, what's the cost of that? What needs to go into that, like lumber, tool rental, rain barrels, etc. So these are just a number of things to consider. And then also planting days, so your volunteers get stipends, food and drink for the events. And then maintenance costs, not all plants survive to year 2 and year 3. So assume that some of the plants might need to be replaced. So you want to budget some funds for that instead of using all the grant money in the first year. And then some of the lot designs also require contractors to maybe install edging or to change the grade of the land. Also, if it's a green stormwater infrastructure design, there's certainly a lot of contractor and professional fees that need to be included in the budget. And then lastly, these are some examples of great site plans and base maps. They don't have to be as colorful, but the one on the left was a perennial propagator lot design site plan that was submitted last year. And what we liked about that was they included the lot dimensions up here on the left. And this template can be found in our workbook on our BFC Lots website. And they also included the total planting area down below, which helps them figure out how many plants they need. And then, the water catchment, everything that they plan on building, how they plan on using the space for like classroom, etc. And then on the left, there's a before and a planned after that we really liked. Removing the concrete, dumping any extra dumping, removing any like fallen or dead trees, and then on the right afterwards, after planting it with new trees and mulch paths and stuff like that. So those are just particularly good site plans that were submitted last year. I think that one of the keys is make sure, again, it doesn't have to be as colorful, like I said, but including the dimensions of the site and how big your planting area is really helpful for us when we're reviewing these applications. So that's it. I think that we can move to any questions that we might have. Tamika and Susan, I know that you've been monitoring the questions. I can't see them on my screen.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about Keep Growing Detroit's Garden Resource Program and what they offer to folks?
Sure. So the Garden Resource Program has a few different tiers for membership, family membership, community membership, school membership. So those are different prices. I think it might range from like $10 to $30 or something. 40. Amazing. Yeah, so they offer different things throughout the year. They have a number of workshops as part of their education series, but they also offer seeds and fruit trees and they have other plants and discounts for plant material throughout the year. Plants, Tori also says. Yeah, flower seeds, vegetable herb seeds, trees, fruit trees. They also offer soil testing for garden resource members, and we strongly encourage you to get your soil tested if you want to do a land-based project. We require all grantees to have their soil tested as soon as they get into the program. One, to test for lead, to see if the soil should even be disturbed based upon lead content. But two, your soil composition can really be a huge determinant when coming up with your planting palette. You might want to plant something and based upon your soil composition, it just will not survive. And so we often, in technical assistance, will advise for you to plant, a substitute thing, something that might do better in clay soil versus sand or vice versa. So Keep Growing Detroit's Garden Resource member program will help you, figure out how to get your soil tested for that.
I think-
Marcellus, yeah, Susan?
Nope, sorry, go ahead.
I was looking at the chat now. One of the questions was, are certain things not allowed? I think I'm gonna unmute everyone. So I'm not quite sure if that
Bring
question.
all that to the person, because you was using it, you punched it yourself. They had it, they should have.
You can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you wanted to ask another question, but I'm not quite sure. Are certain trees not allowed? It depends on what you're asking that for. In our lot designs, there are no trees that I can think of that are like explicitly not allowed. The city of Detroit does have a tree, like a preferred tree list, but that's something different.
I think that's all the questions in the chat box.
Okay, great. Well, if nobody has any other questions, we can wrap this up. I will say this has been recorded, and I can also share this presentation with all of you as well. So if you have any other questions afterwards, you're also welcome to email me. But thank you all for attending. Thanks for our panelists.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Okay,
Bye.
bye.